Welcome, one and all, to this Endgame video that I'm going to be doing for everyone who's interested. So, the Endgame is something I've been getting a lot of questions about recently. I did a video series on calculation, and it kind of was peripheral to it because I was talking about evaluation of positions, how you evaluate king safety, piece activity, material. And some people were talking about how these things seem to change over the course of the game. And I was getting some comments in Discord and some messages, and people were asking me, well, what about the end game? Do these things still apply? And this kind of led to more discussion where some people were actually not completely sure, like, when is it the end game? At what point does king safety not matter that much? And when should you start pushing the pawns instead of using the higher value pieces, that kind of thing. So I decided to do a little bit of a explication of what endgame means and then show some examples that I have been looking at in the last 2 weeks that I thought might be interesting to everyone. So we're starting with this one because this is clearly an endgame. It's an obvious endgame situation because most people, they at least understand that the endgame generally means few pieces. We're never going to talk about a middle game where there's 5 pieces on the board. So this is definitely endgame, even if you have a very naive understanding of what endgame means. So for this one, I think we could just start with it as a puzzle. Maybe just see if anyone knows what the best thing is for white here. It's white to play. So you guys can volunteer if you like. And I'll just talk a little bit about why this is endgamey. So some features of the endgame that are well known include the prominence of the king activity. In the early part of the game, usually we don't use the king that much unless we're forced to. For example, maybe in the fried liver attack opening, we have to capture a piece on f7 with our king. And so that's an example of early king use, but it's not really voluntary. It's something that is kind of done to us and we have to move our king. So it's pretty rare, although there are some striking examples of early king play. Now, in the endgame, it's almost as a rule the case that the kings need to participate. It's a matter of necessity that they participate. It's not something that is really optional or something that only happens sometimes. The king almost always plays a role in the endgame. The only time that's not true is usually when one side plays really badly, I guess, and you can just kind of beat them with some tactics in the endgame. And tactics do happen in the endgame. One misconception about endgames is that they're not tactical. There's no interesting stuff. People talk about these dry endgames. I don't know where they are, the dry endgames that they're talking about. I think endgames are usually full of a lot of interesting details, a lot of interesting features. Even this one, which has only 3 pieces in it. So this is a king and pawn endgame, and studies of king and pawn endgames are sometimes called kindergarten studies. Not because they're easy. Certainly there are not really any super easy positions in chess. If you think it's easy, probably you just don't know it very well. But they call it kindergarten study because it involves the smaller pieces, the pawns. So let's see. Would anyone like to volunteer a move for white? So 66, I saw you followed recently. Thank you very much. And king d2 seems good for white, and suggesting that king e2 and king c2 transpose. So let's talk about that. These 3 moves might seem at first to be indistinguishable, that they all lead to the same thing. That would be true if your next goal is to go here, because all 3 of these moves have the same possibility of playing king d3 on the next move. I think this is actually sort of like where people start thinking the endgame is a dry, boring thing. They think that all the moves are the same, but there are actually some interesting differences. So let's start with the evaluation of the position. So I guess we would say that white is better because they have a material superiority, but actually they also have a more activity, but it's a very small difference, which is why this position is interesting. Both of the kings kind of stand badly on the edge of the board. Normally in the middle game and the opening, we say that if the king's on the edge of the board, that's pretty good. It's safe. Maybe we could hide it behind some pawns, but not so in this case. The kings need to participate. Another interesting thing about the endgame is people often rate the king as a very weak piece, so they decide not to use it. So it's good that you're suggesting king d2. But let's talk about the winning plan. What is white going to do to win the game? If you just had to explain it in words or like short variation, something like that, how would we bring this home and make it a full point with just one extra pawn and almost everything else being similar? Winning plan doesn't mean like a variation per se, but yeah, like you're saying, white wants to get the opposition and get the king in front of the pawn. So if we could airdrop this king and just place him right here, like on c7 or a7, this is the promised land. We really want to go on these spots. Jumping chess horse. Yeah, I see you. You picked up my cultural reference. Thank you. So we're just looking at this first position, and I'd invite you to suggest a solution. We were just talking about how if we can get the king onto one of these two squares, it'll be kind of perfect because then the pawn can just run unopposed. So the real question is, how do we accomplish this task? There are many ways, it seems. 66 said that king c2, king d2, and king e2, they all seem to lead more or less to the same thing. However, there is some major difference among these three moves. I also think it's interesting that 66 did not include the moves king c1 or king e1. This is judicious, but it can sometimes lead to the development of poor intuition, because if you always rule out these kinds of lateral moves, you're going to miss it in some important instances when these are actually the only moves. So some people who have some endgame familiarity, they think, all right, I need to bring the king forward. But forward is not always the same thing as active. In this case, it kind of is, but I guess we'll see. So any suggestions? Maybe you guys could just pick one move and then see what black will do and take it from there. Nerf Russians, welcome. We're just solving this first exercise with white to play. Black to play is also somewhat interesting, but not that much. Okay, so jumping chess horse is trying to remember some endgame theory. That's another interesting thing about endgames, and one of the defining features of the endgame. We can frequently study it in a systematic way, like the openings. So there's a lot of literature about the endgame. We have these endgame primers. So some people think endgames are just the things that you find in endgame books, which is to a great extent true. So sometimes you can learn these things by rote. In fact, this position appears in many endgame books. So 66 says king c2 seems flexible. Might want to bring the king around using the a file. So let's talk about that for a second. Let's say we play a move like king c2. What is black's defensive plan? I guess it's pretty straightforward. Anyone? Certainly they can't just sit there, and they only have one piece to move. So I guess the question is, where do they want their king, really? A specific square or maybe a general area is fine. King e7. Okay, so we'll play king e7 in our mind. And what would your next step be? I guess if we're trying to keep going forward, it would be either king b3, king c3, or king d3. If it's hard to decide, I can maybe make a decision, or a suggestion rather. So I guess black is going to try the same thing no matter what. They're going to come here and try to come here. And that failing, they're going to go here or here. Basically, they're going to end up on one of these squares. So I'm going to highlight them in some different color. Oh no, it's the same color. They're going to try to end up on the B file, basically. They're going to try to interfere with white's ability to get to those blue squares. So which path should we choose that prevents them from stopping us? It seems maybe a little bit subtle and not straightforward, but I'm sure someone here can give me the answer. Nerf Russians, who recently joined in, he's certainly an endgame aficionado. He will trade queens even if it costs him a piece. He loves trading queens. So whatever move we pick, they're going to play next king d6. So if we play a move like king c3, which is probably the most obvious, we play this on like king c3, they'll next play king c6. And after king c4, we could actually already end the variation. So I'm going to play that and show it out. So king c2, king e7. This is what black will do no matter what. If we just run straight up the board, we reach this position. Now, if you know this from your endgame studies, you'll know that this is a theoretical draw. Yeah, exactly. It is a draw. So this means we can reject this. But if you're not convinced, I'll just show it. The reason this is a draw, it's not as simple as them having the opposition. Sometimes opposition doesn't matter. But this thing called opposition, when the kings are an odd number of squares away on the same color, the side that has to move has to give some ground. It's like football. They go this way, we go this way. If they go this way, we go that way. And so we can kind of gain territory this way using opposition. So since they have the opposition, white has to move around, but they have this pawn in the way. So if they go back, then black comes up. And we can actually make some superficial progress. Like if we go here, black has to step back. We go here. And we can start pushing the pawn. And we can repeat this algorithm where we create the same position but farther up the board several times until we finally reach this position and come to the horrible realization that the next move will be stalemate or draw by insufficient material. So what gives, right? The problem was actually this position that we mentioned first. The position in which black has the opposition. So we did not get our king in front as we wanted. This is a position where we are destined to fail in reaching those squares initially highlighted as blue. So jumping chess horse suggested king d2. Okay, what's next, jumping chess horse? Let's keep these moves flowing. See if we can solve this. I guess king e7. I suggested king e7 before. So what would white's next move be? Black's defensive plan is basically the same no matter what. Just want to get in front of that pawn so that they cannot push it and make a queen. If we try to go straight forward like king d3, they're going to play exactly the same way. So it'd be like king d3, king d6, king d4, king c6. And this position is also a draw, even though you reach it with black to play. So it's kind of interesting. I'll just show it. All right, so if we go here, it'll be white to play again. So if we play king d4, we reach the same position, but it's black's turn. So this is remotely interesting because you would think that the opposition would make all the difference, but it actually doesn't because they can pass the turn and we cannot make a useful improvement with our king. If we go back in any way, shape, or form, they will attack the pawn and then back up, and it's just the same situation again and again. And like I showed earlier, we can start pushing the pawn down the board, but it makes no difference. So this is kind of to no avail. And just to be crystal clear, if we try king d5, they're going to attack and win the pawn. It will become a draw instantly. So that's a shame. So we tried king c2 and we tried king d2. But that doesn't mean that one of those moves is wrong. Although I can say that king d2 is not quite working because we saw that no matter which path we choose at the end, right, when we went up here, we could choose c4 or d4, but it didn't matter. We still got that same position. All right, so Motosem's welcome. You're suggesting king e3 after king d2 for a distant opposition. So that's interesting. It means that you guys have studied some endgames. Now, distant opposition means, again, it's an odd number of squares in between. 1, 2, 3. The kings are on the same color. So this means that if we close the gap in a judicious way, we should be able to get opposition. But we have to also understand when opposition matters. It's not just a matter of knowing what opposition is. Opposition is probably the most well-known endgame technique. But it only matters when it allows us to take control of key squares. So let's pretend that we bring this to its logical conclusion. For example, I play king d6, you play king d4. It doesn't actually allow us to take control of any key squares, because they play king c6, king c4, we reach that same position again. Now, 66 is saying c2, b3, a4 path for the king looks interesting, so let's examine it. Black will defend the same way. Is this really different, guys? Any difference here? Okay, and what's the difference from 66? You're saying king a5. Let's say I play maybe king b7, because my whole plan was to go in front of the pawn. Alright, so this is a typical mistake. You said b5. This position is also a theoretical draw. It looks slightly different from before, but it's a well-known draw. Okay, king b5. This makes a lot more sense. Good. So king b5, it takes the opposition, but in a situation where it matters. Opposition in any position, it's not necessarily sensible. For example, we could play e4, e5, first moves of the game, and then king e2, distant opposition. Right? It doesn't make any sense in that situation. Now here it makes a lot of sense. Alright, we got a chess aid just raided with the channel with 7 viewers. Awesome. So thanks for the raid, chess aid, and feel free to make your presence known. We're just doing some studying here. Now I was just showing that whatever move they pick, for example king c7, we're going to outflank them. This is another endgame technique, and we're going to reach that square that I highlighted in blue earlier. And since we reach that square, we are definitely going to win the game. So they can try as they like, but we're going to reach the critical position slightly differently. Like, let's say they play this. We're finally on that amazing square, and then the pawn just rolls in. And they have to step away, and then watch in abject terror as the queen returns to the board. So here we are. So this position's definitely an endgame. This was very clear from the start. It doesn't go against anyone's intuition of what it means to be an endgame, but this next example will.